Well, actually, Bev, the officials in Henan gave this figure, pretty extraordinary figure, saying that almost 90% of the population there has already been infected with COVID, and they gave that figure to say that the peak of the outbreak had passed. And Henan has about 100 million people or so we're talking huge numbers, 90 million or so infected just in probably the last couple of months, really. But it's not just Henan in central China where officials have been saying that the Omicron wave peak has passed. Also, officials in Beijing, the mayor of Beijing, said that in the capital, the outbreak wave is already starting to go down. And also in eastern Jiangsu province, as well as in southwestern Chongqing, officials in those places too, in the last day or two, have said that the Omicron wave has peaked. So this might be a little bit a case of officials trying to send some messaging out there to tell people in those cities and provinces, hey, relax, don't worry, the worst of it's over, get back to work, get back to economic activity. Or it might actually be true because it looks like the virus was actually circulating in bigger numbers than the figures led on prior to the opening up in early December. So either way, Bev, the message, at least in China, is that the worst of it is over. But of course, the problem always remains that we're just not getting particularly transparent figures. We're getting little bits of information on certain provinces or certain cities like Henan, which are quite interesting, but the nationwide picture in terms of the number of infections and probably more importantly the number of deaths is pretty hard to get a gauge on.
Yeah, and it is this complete U-turn compared to how they sort of managed their way through the peak of COVID. Even with this opening of the borders yesterday, as the sort of wave is passing through, is it just... How clear is it, Bill, as to who is allowed to come and go with the reopening of China?
Well, it's a fluid situation, Bev. It's even changed today because, first of all, people with business visas, family reunion visas, study visas, they can apply to go to China, but it is not open for tourism yet. So, short-term visitors going there on a tourism visa, that currently is not something you can apply for. But the reason why it's fluid is today the Chinese government announced it is suspending short-term visitor visas for people in South Korea. And just in the last few hours, we've seen reports out of Japan that the Chinese government or representatives of the Chinese government has advised that it will not be issuing short-term visitor visas for Japanese nationals either. Both these two measures, only the South Korea one has been confirmed by Beijing. Both of these are retaliation for the COVID screening and testing measures that those two countries have taken towards China. Now, you might wonder, how does that apply to Australia? Because Australia too is requiring people from China to get COVID tests. But South Korea is a bit of a different case, Bev. It actually suspended short-term visitor visas from people in China. So this is sort of tit-for-tat retaliation. As for Japan, the Japanese government actually strengthened its COVID measures, now requiring people from China to get tests both before and after the flight. So we're seeing the beginning of Beijing's retaliation, but whether that would extend further to other countries like Australia, probably doubtful, because, as we've said many times, the Chinese government itself requires people to get a pre-departure COVID test before going to China.
Yeah, so they probably are on a par, Australia and China, at the moment with their requirements. So do you think down the track, in the weeks and months, things might open up even further in terms of tourism and a greater flow of people out of China and back in?
Yeah, for sure. At the moment, the airline capacity is about 1/10 of what it was prior to the pandemic. We're talking international flights in and out of China. So there's been no immediate ramp up in the number of international flights despite the opening. As we've spoken about before, a lot of people in China who would be pretty happy to have an overseas holiday, they're probably holding off not just for the lack of flights, but also too, you have the Lunar New Year coming up very soon, and that's the traditional holiday period when people have time off work. So it's more likely, once that commences in about a week and a half's time, you'd have more demand for people to fly out of the country. But so long as flights remain limited and very expensive, you're not going to see a surge of Chinese tourists going back out again. Obviously, over time, you can only assume that those flights would be restored gradually. And whether or not we'll see similar numbers, Bev, to the large numbers of Chinese tourists who used to come to Australia before the pandemic, not sure on that one, because even when China's economy bounces back after the reopening, it will take a few months, but it will be chugging again. It's still going to be slower than what it was in those years before the pandemic. So whether or not people have as much disposable income to get on flights and go not to countries nearby like Thailand and Japan, but to countries like Australia, that's yet to be seen.
Good to talk, Bill. Thanks so much for that.
Thanks, Bev.